everybody. Hey, is everybody excited to learn about a very serious threat? Because tonight's going to, you are going to be blown away. We are so grateful to have really the world's experts on the threat, really an existential threat to the United States and to our freedom here today. So I'm delighted to have you all here. And we're going to spend some time talking about what we call the threat from China, communist China. But it's really multiple threats. It's not just one threat. It's a threat on so many dimensions. Military dimension, artificial intelligence, espionage, financial. I mean, it just goes, it runs the gamut. Our supply chain even is so thoroughly dependent on China. You'll hear about that tonight. And we'd like to take you through some of this in a very organized way. And one of the things that I have found personally is that as I have begun to talk about the China issue, I find that people may not know all of the facts that they would like to know and need to know and have the awareness and depth. But at the same time, I think we're striking a very positive raw nerve. I think that a deep belief that China is our major adversary going forward, and we need to be doing all we can to be vigilant. So when it happened that I had the great good fortune to meet Frank Gaffney, who's standing over here to my left, and began talking to him several months ago, he began talking about what he's doing now. Now, Frank's background is that he actually is the founder of the Center for Security Policy many years ago, which is a think tank, a positive think tank, whose real mission is to understand those threats to the United States and expose them and help us all get informed. While doing that, one of the major issues, of course, that would come out of that is the threat from communist China. And so it's such an important initiative that he said, what we've got to do is we've got to create a separate, independent entity to really illuminate this threat. And that is now known as the Committee on the Present Danger of China. Committee on the Present Danger of China. You're going to hear a lot more about that tonight. And he's going to explain a little bit about how that a predecessor committee, the Committee on the Present Danger with regard to the Soviet Union, was so successful in helping us blunt that threat and eventually take down the Soviet Union as a major threat to the United States in the same way that it was during the Reagan era. I'm just very excited about being to know Frank. And one of the things that happened is that as we spent some time learning about the Committee on the Present Danger of China, my wife Karen and I said, you know, this is just something we really need to get involved in and really go all in, because there's nothing more important to our national security and maintenance of our freedom than being able to understand and then address this threat. So we're doing that. And today, it was just wonderful. Frank, and standing beside Frank is Joe Bosco. Joe's background includes being at the Defense Department, and importantly being on the China's desk, that is being the China expert in the Defense Department under the administration of George W. Bush. So Joe is a true expert on China, per se. And then over here we have Sean Lin. Sean is grew up in China, and what's really interesting about Sean is that he is a survivor of the massacre in Tiananmen Square. Sean is also, to his great credit, a PhD, and then decided to enlist in the United States Army as an enlisted person, rose to the rank of captain in the Army, and then most recently was at the Walter Reed Hospital in charge of the Department of Viral Disease, which is very topical now given the coronavirus, right? So we are blessed to have these three gentlemen with us tonight. And in a moment, I'm going to turn it over to Frank. Frank's going to give you a little bit of background on the committee, what we're doing. By the way, we just had an enormously successful day today in New Hampshire. We were on Jack Heath, we were Chris Ryan on the radio, we did WCNL in Newport. We met with 8 state legislators today to begin talking about the situation. The governor's office, we're on a wonderful show with Janine. We were down in Merrimack today on TV. It's been, and then of course here with Mayor Tim Gatsis, who's been a great host as well, who's now on the Governor's Council. And so we're getting the word out here in New Hampshire. They're going to continue to do that in other places around the country, but have done it in Iowa last week, New Hampshire, South Carolina, Nevada. I don't know if you can see a trend, but those are all presidential primary states. So we're getting the word out and trying to do that. So I'm going to turn it over now to Frank, and Frank will take us through a little bit, and then Joe and Sean, we've got a video guest here. Roger Robinson will be joining us, and we have a PowerPoint with some poll results and some other information that I think you're going to find really important. So we'll get it started. Thanks, Frank.
Good evening. Thank you very much for being here. I want to thank BJ and his team for making all of this work. Our colleagues, I'll say a little bit more about in a moment. Jay, particular thanks to you for engineering this important visit. Also, a word of special thanks to a dear friend of mine who got out of the swamp and migrated up here to the North Country, Bill Ludi, who I hope you all know, a great leader in the national security space and a dear friend of mine. So Bill, glad you're here. I'm going to say, again, just a few words about the history that brings us to the point where we think we can make a real difference with the help of people like yourself. It's one that, when I was the age of many of you, I became sort of formed by when, in about 1976, a committee on the present danger came together to help one of its members, a fellow by the name of Ronald Reagan, devise a strategy that would be an alternative to what was then called détente. It's basically a policy of seeing if we can't just engage with an adversary, and by engaging with them, by, well, frankly, enriching them or appeasing them, we can't make the problem that they represent go away. Reagan didn't believe that. This committee that came together of business leaders and national security experts and subject matter specialists and human rights and religious freedom advocates helped him fashion a strategy that he came to call peace through strength as an alternative, one that would actually set about trying to roll back the Soviet Union rather than continue to essentially perpetuate. They helped him both devise that strategy and sell it as a public policy choice to the American people, who voted for him over the then incumbent president, Jimmy Carter. And he began, with the help of members of the Committee on the Present Danger, some 31 of them, in fact, to execute the strategy, and the rest, as they say, is history. The Soviet Union is no more because that strategy was effectively executed. We are inspired by such a success to see what we can do about an existential threat to freedom in our time that we believe is actually vastly more serious than that one was. When you look at it all together, and that's what we're here to tell you about tonight, all together, the threat posed by communist China is truly existential. And Reagan warned that every generation faces such an existential threat to freedom. He said, freedom is not passed on through the bloodstream. It has to be fought for and protected and turned over to the next generation to do the same. So that's why we're here in New Hampshire on the eve of the first in the nation primary and the contribution it will make to the public policy choices for the next 4 years and perhaps many more. We're here to talk to people like you and voters more generally in this state, in the hopes that you will help us talk to the people who are applying for the job of the next commander-in-chief. Because whether they know it or not, and with all due respect, whether you know it or not. Their number one job, certainly in the national security space, and probably in the economic space, and who knows, as Sean will talk about a bit, maybe even in the public health space, number one problem is going to be contending with the threat from China. We need to know now, before they get the gig, whether they actually understand that reality, that threat, and whether they have any clue about what needs to be done about it. So we're actually hoping that first and foremost, you can help us elicit from them, certainly over the next 5 or 6 days, when they're going to be in your living rooms and on your televisions and in your radio shows and so on. Do they get it? To the point where you're satisfied they should be entrusted with this awesome responsibility to protect this country we love and our freedoms against a threat that is determined to diminish all of them and perhaps actually destroy us. Now that may sound incredible, so we're here to talk to you about several different aspects of that threat. And I'm really delighted to be joined by a man that I've come to admire greatly. He's one of the founding members of the Committee on the Present Danger, China. He served in the George W. Bush administration as the duty officer in the Pentagon. If you knew him there, Bill, he was there working on the China portfolio for the Secretary of Defense. His name is Joseph Bosco, as you've heard, and we're going to have him sort of situate this challenge in a little bit of a historical context that helps explain how did we get here? Why is this now so hard? And he's got some ideas about what to do about it too. Joseph Bosco. Thank you.
Since we're in a presidential primary year, presidential election year, I will give you a little bit of history. In 1960, John Kennedy and Richard Nixon competed for the presidency, and they agreed on one thing. Red China was a serious threat to the United States. When Nixon ran the second time in '68, he had to develop a plan for how to deal with China, because we had fought the Chinese in the Korean War for 3 years. They had helped North Korea invade South Korea. By the time Nixon became president, they were also fighting us in Vietnam. They developed the concept of wars of national liberation around the world, Latin America, Asia, Africa, to overthrow governments that were Western or pro-Western. They were basically a declared enemy of the United States. Nixon said this cannot go on. There's got to be a change. We cannot have wars with China. We've got to bring them into the family of engagement. The idea was that by projecting our goodwill toward China, they would moderate their policies, both at home, where they had killed 50 million people at that time under Mao Zedong's insane rule. And Nixon said, we've got to change that. He had as his assistant, his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, who supported Nixon's efforts, but with a slightly different agenda. Kissinger had not studied China, had not worked on China at all, as a professor at Harvard. But he saw China as a card to be played against the Soviet Union. He also thought if we made a deal with China, they would help us get out of Vietnam with honor. It turns out that that did not happen. Détente did not work with the Soviet Union. China did not help us get out of Vietnam with honor. And in the meantime, we had made a series of concessions to China. We pulled the 7th Fleet out of the Taiwan Strait. We pulled our forces out of Taiwan. We pledged in Nixon's second term that we would recognize China instead of Taiwan. We did all those things. China did not do the things that it had promised. By 1979, Jimmy Carter was president, and he then formally recognized China and de-recognized Taiwan. Congress was outraged at this, what they felt was a betrayal of Taiwan, and they passed what is called the Taiwan Relations Act. This pledged that the United States would continue its unofficial relations with Taiwan, even though we no longer were officially recognized, and that we would provide defensive arms to Taiwan so that they could resist any Chinese communist threat. Unfortunately, the TRA, as is known, did not specifically commit the United States to defend Taiwan, simply to provide weapons that Taiwan could use to defend itself. And we would try to keep unofficial relations, but we would not have official relations with them. So there was an ambiguity. It's been called strategic ambiguity. We kind of left it open, whether we'll defend Taiwan or whether we won't. In 1995, something happened that gave us the opportunity to clarify that ambiguity. Taiwan had its first direct presidential election in March of 1996. And in the run-up to that election, China showed its great displeasure with Taiwan's emerging democracy. It fired missiles across the Taiwan Strait to threaten the country not to vote, not to participate in the election at all, and certainly not to vote for the person who was most independent-minded. President Clinton sent an aircraft carrier through the Taiwan Strait. This is the first time one had gone through since Nixon had pulled the 7th Fleet out. China objected vigorously at this trespass, this interference with Chinese sovereignty, because they saw the Taiwan Strait as their own territorial waters. Clinton, the administration, instead of saying, these are international waters, which they are, we can go through them anytime we want. They said, well, it was because of bad weather we were forced to go through. That was a bad signal to China. A few months later, the election was about to be held in Taiwan, and they again fired missiles across the Taiwan Strait. And this time, Clinton said 2 aircraft carriers. But China said if they enter the strait, they'll face a sea of fire. We didn't send them through the strait. So by now, China was getting a message that maybe the U.S. wasn't committed to the defense of Taiwan. So they asked directly the Assistant Secretary of State, what would you do, U.S., if we attacked Taiwan? The Assistant Secretary, instead of saying the Taiwan Relations Act gives us at least a moral commitment to defend Taiwan, and we will defend it. Instead, he said, we don't know, and you don't know. It would depend on the circumstances. Well, that was an interesting invitation to China. It would depend on the circumstances. In other words, if the situation were so dangerous for the U.S., it would not defend Taiwan. That was the beginning of a massive Chinese military buildup. Attack submarines, anti-ship ballistic missiles. They had the idea that if they built enough of these things that would endanger U.S. ships, we would stay out. Just a couple of months ago, a Chinese admiral said, we need to sink 1 or 2 of those U.S. carriers and kill 5,000 to 10,000 sailors. Then the U.S. will see the issues more clearly. In fact, in 1996, one of the generals said, you care more about Los Angeles than you do about Taiwan. So here we are now, 25 years after Nixon's opening that was going to moderate China and make it more friendly toward the West, and they're talking about nuclear weapons on Los Angeles and other American cities. That was the pattern that continued year after year, administration after administration. We continued to make concessions to China to try to engage them. We convinced ourselves that if we moderated our policies, they would moderate theirs. it hasn't worked out that way. Whether it's on human rights, trade, on North Korea, on the South China Sea, on issue after issue, China has been hostile and confrontational to the U.S. and to the West generally. So what we have after 40 years of engagement, we have the same hostile China that Nixon thought he was going to moderate, except now it's by multiple orders of magnitude, it is more powerful, wealthier, and more dangerous to the United States and its security. So that's where we are today in this presidential election, and we hope that the candidates will address those issues.
Thank you, Joe, very much. Next, we're going to hear from Sean Lin. As has been mentioned, he's, I think of him as kind of a trifecta, actually. You heard that he was in Tiananmen Square the night the massacre went down and survived it. You've also heard about his service to our country in the United States Army. Two bookends to that service. He is a practitioner of Falun Gong, which, as many of you may know, is a religious practice in China that has been brutally persecuted by the Communist Chinese government. I'll tell you more about how. At the end of his time in the Army, he also served as the director of a laboratory at Walter Reed Hospital. It specialized in viral diseases, which equips him rather brilliantly to talk to us about one of the other facets of the threat from China at the moment, namely what's coming to be called the novel coronavirus. So I want you to hear from a man who has firsthand experience of what the Chinese Communist Party and government are about. And I just want you to keep in your head this one thought. As he tells you several quite troubling anecdotes. A government that treats its own people this badly is not likely to be more considerate of ours. So, Sean, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Frank, for the nice introduction. It's my honor to join everyone tonight, and it's also my honor to follow Joe to present this. And when he talked about the policy mistake, it really reminds me why so many governments in the world fall into a wrong policy against China for the past few decades. So to me, a fundamental issue is that many other governments treat the Chinese government as a normal government. But Chinese government is not like that. Chinese government, at every level of the government, you have the Communist Party in control. No matter it's central government, provincial government, city government, down to very low level, village level, you always have Communist Party members, party secretary at different levels. So like the whole China is run by two systems basically. And the Communist Party is like a vampire possessed on the normal government structure. So if any foreign government, you treat it, Chinese government as a normal government, you're wrong. The premier is not the one in charge, the president may not be the one in charge. It's whoever who's the Communist Party Secretary General is in charge of China. They are the vampire sucking on Chinese people's blood, and they are in control, and they are the one aggressively try to take the communist ideology globally and try to kill through violence and conquer the world. So it's a vampire behind it. So when you're dealing with a normal government, of course, you think about different normal policy. You can engage them, you welcome the country into the world of nations, right? But Communist Party doesn't think like that. The Communist Party is always very aggressive, trying to take control and want to take people's lives. So, as Frank mentioned, when I was very young, when I was just a freshman in college, and happened to be in 1989, and I was with the student till the last night, and when the crackdown started on the eve of on the evening of June 3rd, 1989. So fortunately, I was able to lead with the last group of students withdraw from the Tiananmen Square. While at the time, the military already opened fire at Tiananmen Square. And there are students who don't want to leave the square because they don't believe they're going to will kill them. So I don't know how many exactly died in the square. And even when I left the square, when we headed north and we passed a junction, we actually ran into a tank because the tank passing by, and students were petrified. We were shocked because the tank was so close to us. So one student was actually so scared, he fell on the street. And then the tank stopped. It already passed, but it stopped. And then intensely rolled back, crashed the student's head. So this is the first time I saw people's head like a piece of paper on the ground. You know, everyone was shocked, we were petrified. You know, so these things you never forget. Even 30 years passing by, you never forget. And it's like a nightmare repeating if you look at the last 30 years. Because you saw the tank already pass by, maybe the danger is gone, but the Communist Party can always do something even worse to you. So, you know, starting from July 1999, Chinese government launched a huge crackdown on the Falun Gong group. And Falun Gong is an ancient Chinese meditation system based on the Buddha school's teaching and focused on the principle of truthfulness, compassion, and tolerance. So it attracts so many people in China in the 90s, grew even bigger than the Communist Party. So the government was very nervous, and so they labeled this group as an evil cause, and then they started a nationwide crackdown. And for the first few years, we already see so many Falun Gong prisoners being incarcerated in China. And then starting on 2006, there are news being broke out in China that many Falun Gong prisoners was actually organ harvesting. So this organ harvesting is actually care on demand system the Chinese government established. But because they got millions of people incarcerated, so they quickly can collect your blood type sample, your tissue sample, find the matchings, right? And you can establish this information into a big nationwide database. So working with the transplant center from military hospitals, civilian hospitals, they can meet the needs from foreigners or from party elites. So when they want to do an organ transplant for someone, as long as they find a match in the system, they can go to the labor camp, they go to the detention center, kill that person, take the organ and make profit. So that's why China's transplant business is booming for the last 20 years. And huge profit, because in China, you just only need to wait 2 weeks to get a liver transplant, kidney transplant, and 1 month and 2 months for a liver transplant. While in the United States, with a very healthy, complete voluntary donation systems, people wait 10 years for a liver transplant. Because even, for example, you have just assume you have 10,000 people in the registry, you may have only one people matching it, right? So it's very high. You need to have a very large pool of people in order to have such a large volume of organ transplant in China. So Chinese government cannot even find an explanation that can justify such a large volume of organ transplant. At the beginning, they said it's execute prisoner, and then later they said we established a voluntary system. Like if you look at all the major cities in China, the voluntary registration system is so pathetic. Very few people in Chinese will donate their organs because it's against traditional belief. Yeah, people want to have impact voting even after they pass away. So this has been rampant evil practice in China for the last 20 years. And last year, the China Tribunal actually, it's an independent tribunal, and they found out very solid evidence saying these evil practices are ongoing in China in a very systematic scale and still ongoing. So this is how Chinese government is. They don't care about people's life, and they can still do it every day. And so quickly back on about the coronavirus that Frank mentioned about. So it's a repeat of history. because you remember the 2003 when SARS outbreak, Chinese government covered it for almost 5 months, from November 2002 all the way to April. They finally opened up to the public. There's a SARS outbreak in China, and this time, starting from last year, December, early December, they already know there's a SARS outbreak in local Wuhan, and they arrested doctors who exposed this outbreak. Eight doctors shared this information on their social media, and these people got interrogated by the police and then silenced. And ironically, these 8 doctors now in the front battling with the outbreak. Yeah, so the government covered up, and they didn't tell the public how severe the situation it is. So the government even still organized large community parties. On January 18th, they organized more than 130,000 people to have a community party to celebrate the Chinese New Year. Can you imagine how many people can get infected in such a big party? And then when the government feel like they cannot control the situation, they finally decided to announce the situation. It's already kind of too late. 5 million people already left Wuhan city to go back to home to celebrate Chinese New Year before the government closed down the city. So these people are everywhere in China right now. So even today we had news, another city in China, Wenzhou, not too far away from Shanghai, is gonna lock down again. Because that city have 180,000 people working in Wuhan, and they're already back to the city. So you got another kind of epicenter again. So how could China control this situation? On the surface, the government is trying to portray they are working so hard, they're using these draconian measures to control the outbreak. But they are the one creating the problem, making it so terrible, and it is even spreading to the global world right now. But that's why when Chinese Communist Party don't care about people's life, the threat, not just for the Chinese people, it's to the whole world. Everybody suffers. And when any government who believes in the lies from the Communist Party, they always take a very, very serious lesson from them. So I'm glad to have this opportunity to present this issue to everyone.
I have one question. During the Tiananmen Square massacre, that time period, there was a famous picture that went out of a student standing in front of the tank.
Did
that person survive, or was he not?
That person is not a student, but quickly after the incident happened, he got arrested by the police. Eventually, what his whereabouts, nobody knows.
It's just
Thank you, Sean, very much.
Thank you.
Well done. So we're going to I mentioned that one of the reasons we were here in New Hampshire at this moment in time was to try to inject these kinds of issues into the presidential context. There's another reason, and that is in the course of the 10 or so months that we've been in business as an organization, the Committee on the Present Danger of China, one of the things that we've tumbled upon, thanks to help from the man you're going to see momentarily on the video, Roger Robinson, is the fact that all of these terrible things that are being done in China are basically being done thanks to money we are providing the Chinese government and companies that do work for it. Whether it's oppressing the people of China, whether it's building islands in the South China Sea to control the transit over and through those international waters, which Bill Rudy back in the day used to steam through from time to time, I'm sure. Whether it's proliferating weapons of mass destruction, for which some of these companies have been sanctioned by the United States government, or whether it's even companies that are building weapons with which to target our men and women in uniform, or for that matter, the rest of us. These are companies that are in our capital markets. stock markets and our bond markets getting money from investors, some of them individual investors, some of them institutional investors, like state public pension funds, including this state's, the New Hampshire retirement system. I'm going to show you this video. It's about 9 minutes long that Roger Robinson has done. I'm going to give you some handouts that explain a little bit more about the companies, but I wanted you just to see and hear about this particular problem, because we need your help, frankly, with your state legislators who have a fiduciary responsibility. We're very pleased that some of them are here. A fiduciary responsibility to oversee your public pension fund, which I gather is having some difficulties on other scores. But we need, at a minimum, for those companies that are in the portfolio of the retirees of this state, at the very minimum, to meet the same standards of transparency, of accountability, of good governance, and of material risk disclosure that American companies have to, if they're in our capital markets, under our laws. That seems to be the very minimum. Just responsible governance. So let's listen to Roger Robinson, and we will be back with some final comments and some questions.
As much as $3 trillion of Americans' savings and investment funds have been extracted from the U.S. markets in the form of equity and debt offerings, stocks and bonds, that they have put in our marketplace, and move that money into China for their seemingly unlimited checking account to move around the world, compromising countries, capturing nations, capturing regions and continents, like if you take Africa. In other words, a malevolent use of those funds. The reason that they're a near-peer competitor with the United States militarily, or striving to do so, and are trying to do the same in the technology field, is because we're picking up that tab. I mean, this is the sad truth of the matter. The U.S. capital markets, it's important to remember, have over 60% of the world's liquidity. All of the capital markets of the world combined are not the size of ours. So it's not as though China has someplace else to go. When the 21st century rolled around, we had all the money. It's one of the great last monopolies of the United States, in the sense that we have this absolute dominance in this financial domain on this planet. China knows this. They're in desperate need of dollar liquidity. They are not tapping that $3 trillion in reserves. They need that there to ward off actual diligence being performed by the people that want to do business with them. So they don't touch that. And I can tell you that they don't have all kinds of walking around money that seems to be limitless when you look at their activities. So state public pension systems are a wonderful boon to the Chinese economy, to its military, to its intelligence services, and to their effort to undermine our vital interests, to put them in a position where they could actually defeat the United States and put at risk, if not destroy, all that we hold dear. The stakes couldn't be higher. I mean, we're talking about, again, trillions of dollars, not hundreds of billions, or certainly not tens of billions. But the point is that you need to look at this, because there's been no screening mechanism set up in your state or the other states to look at the material risks, to share value and corporate reputation to these Chinese and Russian enterprises that are associated with human rights and national security abuses of this kind. That's what puts American investors at risk, is material risk. This isn't just an ideological conversation I'm having. It's a market-oriented, sensible, risk-related conversation. And that is something that every fiduciary should care about. This is not politicizing your pension system. this is not contracting your investable universe. This isn't jeopardizing the free flow of capital around the world. All of the arguments that Wall Street wants you to believe. So this is more than just again, a purely financial argument, but the whole thing can be justified, I think, in market practices and what should be SEC regulations that are enforced on ensuring the disclosure of these material risks at minimum to the people of the United States. I mean, how many people do we have in the markets today in our country? 150, 180 million Americans, something of this kind? You know, China is racing to extract or to make us more dependent on their stocks and bonds. They're flooding, if you will, our market with dollar-denominated bonds as well as new equity offerings. Again, at the end of the day, this is fundraising. If they were to attract, as they want to, $2 to $3 trillion more in the next, say, 24, 36 months, you could have a day where Americans wake up, all 150, 180 million of us, and find that 17%, 22%, 25% of our retirement portfolios, of our investment portfolios, are all in Chinese securities. A number of them bad actors. Now just imagine that day when the China lobby, as it's famously called, has scores of millions of Americans joining in because of their vested financial interest in opposing future sanctions or penalties against China, independent of the severity of the offense. Why? Because they're worried about the damage to the value of their investment portfolios. Do we really think that China's not alert to this stealthy effort to make us beholden to them? Do we really believe that they won't use that kind of leverage if they haven't? Well, you see the way they saber rattle about withdrawing in one fell swoop their $1.1 trillion in treasury bills, for example. Of course, it wouldn't have that draconian effect as they like us to believe, but nevertheless, they are all about using whatever leverage they have to ensure that they maintain unfettered access to dollar liquidity and the vast capital markets that we have in our country that are, again, second to none, and where they have nowhere else to go. So I would think that during this period when presidential candidates are rolling through the states, they should be asked, what's their position on the fact that we have hundreds, if not, over 1,000 Chinese companies, some of them, again, bad actors by any measures, human rights abusers, national security abusers. What are we doing about the fact that we've never screened them out, even though they represent an asymmetric material risk to share value and corporate reputation? These companies in China don't disclose their financials. They're regarded as state secrets. How do you perform diligence on them? They don't adhere to PCAOB audits, which all of our American corporate counterparts have to be part of or subject to if they're going to participate in the U.S. capital markets. What about the fact that China is not complying with Dodd-Frank and Sarbanes-Oxley, U.S. securities laws? Do you think that our companies can get away with that? Think again. No way. So China's receiving preferential treatment. Presidential candidates should be asked why. So again, we're in new territory here, but this is the motherlode. This is the most coveted China dream for President Xi that they have. It is to load us up with their stocks and bonds so that in effect, we're beholden to them. And at the same time, they get the kind of vast funding that they need to maintain this seemingly invincible juggernaut that's appeared on the horizon to challenge us in every sphere and to put at risk our primacy in the world and to defeat our way of life. Let's face it. I mean, this is a totalitarian or authoritarian, to be sure, police state, and it's not pretty. And even on those that don't care about national security, should darn right care about human freedom. What about the surveillance state that's being funded here? What about those concentration camps? So this is a bipartisan issue. This is an American issue. And I urge you, all of you, to take it seriously, and those journalists to write about this, and let's get these statistics and these facts out there, because they're not my opinion. They're empirical. And that's the beauty of finance. You can write them down, and there they are. And then you can just choose what you're going to do. And I certainly hope that the audiences that are going to view this today will take this seriously and understand that we're in this together, and we need to be vigilant. Thank you.
Thank you for bearing through that and putting the closing frame at the end. So here's the point. This is something that people like you can do something about, particularly those of you in legislative office. You can do something about it by engaging, certainly for the next couple of days, when there are a handful of people who only care about what you think. That may not be the case after next Tuesday, to be sure, but for the next 7 days or so, they are all about it. In this state, you have extraordinary opportunities, I don't need to tell you, to interact with. I really plead with you to try to, if you have such opportunities, make use of them, to find out whether these next crop of would-be commanders-in-chief understand what you now understand, have thought about it, are preparing to do something about it. Secondly, you have, it seems every other one of you is a representative in your state legislature, right? So there's an opportunity for you, of course, to interact with your neighbors, your friends, those of whom are represented. And I hope you'll take this to them as well. I'll give you a handout here at the end. Let me just close with a very quick sort of treatment of a major national poll that was just released right here in New Hampshire this morning. A survey of 1,000 likely voters across the country. When we wanted to find out what they understood about the threat posed by China, and as they learned more about it, how they would respond to questions about whether they thought it was a problem or not. So I'll go through this very quickly and we'll be into your questions. You can bring that up. Where can I stand? Not in the way. We'll see. There we go. Okay. Are you going to man the slides?
Yes, I will, and we're good to go.
So it was done by McLaughlin and Associates, one of the country's top pollsters, among others, he's worked for the President of the United States. So I know that his accuracy and acuity in evaluating public opinion information is very valuable. Next slide. So I wanted to start with you with the question, do the American people have any idea about the reality that China has set its sights on being the world's next dominant power? And as you see here, some say they are, some say they aren't. We're going to go through a number of slides that suggest that that's not actually been as clear. Go ahead. We asked the question, would you be worried about it if they were the dominant power? And you see the numbers start shooting up. And the interesting thing is here, I don't know if you can read them in the fine print, but these are some of the most important of the demographic breakdowns in the polling. And you'll see that virtually every single one of them are in a majority saying they would be worried about this. Next slide. This talks about 5G. I don't know if that's a term that's familiar to you yet, but you'll be hearing a lot about it in the days ahead. It stands for fifth generation. It's a wireless technology that is the coming thing. And right now, Communist China has a decisive advantage in providing it to the world, including to a number of our allies, despite our warnings about it. Interestingly enough, 70% on average of those demographics said this is of concern, that we might find ourselves dependent upon the Chinese for their wireless technology, which can run everything from, self-driving cars to the so-called Internet of Things, affecting all of our lives and also potentially being weaponized against us. Next slide. This one talks about the use of investment to build out something called the Belt and Road Initiative. This is a kind of colonial enterprise that China is using to develop all over the world, but particularly in places that have strategic choke points and valuable resources. Infrastructure like airports, train networks, road networks, ports, all on credit. How about that? On credit. The only problem is they know, and anybody with a lick of sense knows, that when you go to basically very poor countries and say, we'll give you all this great stuff on your credit card, a fair number of them are not going to be able to make the payments. And what the Chinese have been adept at doing is foreclosing. So in due course, those ports, those airfields, those rail networks, those road networks are actually controlled by China. And they use them, if not immediately, over time, to help increase their military presence in these various areas. Is that a concern? Well, 75% of those responding said it was. Next slide. How about this? We talked a little bit about China's predatory trade practices. This is probably the single most obvious example of what a problem that is. I don't know how many of you knew this, but 70% of those we polled didn't know that the Chinese are now the principal supplier to the United States of prescription medicines. Virtually all of our generic drugs, components of most of our name brand prescription drugs, virtually all of our penicillin, even vitamin C. So the question then was, next slide, might that be worrying? As many of these people, 60% of them, said they were actually on prescription drugs, and I think if you ask their question, would your family be on them, you'd probably get close to 90%, but 69% of them said this is probably a problem. If they might use those supplies of medicine to actually give us drugs that are defective, or maybe even lethal. And there's some evidence that they have. 69% said they thought that was a problem. Next slide. Should we be this dependent? Well, that sort of blew the lid off this thing. 83% said no. And again, understandably so. Next slide. This, again, a lot of fine print, but the point is a social credit system is a kind of Orwellian enterprise on steroids. We've talked a little bit about it, but the Chinese have pulled together an array of technologies, surveillance cameras, facial recognition, gait recognition, speech recognition, data mining, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, to create a degree of awareness about what everybody is doing, not just Falun Gong members, not just Christians, not just Buddhists, not just Uyghur Muslims, everybody is doing virtually all the time, which creates the ultimate mechanism for control of the population. You reward people, for doing the kinds of things the Chinese Communist Party approves of. You punish people for doing the things they don't. So the question was, have you heard about this? And obviously over half had not. Next slide. Would you be worried if such a system were introduced here? Again, overwhelmingly yes. Next slide. How about the use of this against people of faith, for example? Is that acceptable behavior? No, not by a long shot. Next slide. How about the fact that Hikvision, one of the Chinese companies that Roger was talking about, is the supplier of much of this technology to the Chinese government that it is using for these purposes? So much of a problem, in fact, that the administration, the Trump administration, recently put them on a list that makes it illegal to do business with Hikvision. But you can still invest in the company. And in fact, the data that we have shows that the New Hampshire retirement system is invested in Hikvision. Next slide. The question was, should American investors be putting this kind of money into Hikvision and other social credit technologies? And again, you see almost 70% said no. Next slide. How about companies that are building weapon systems? Should they be in our capital markets? 79% said no. As you'll see in the paper I'm going to give you, AVIC, I think it stands for the Aviation Industrial Corporation of China, is in the retirement funds of New Hampshire. Another of the companies that is doing things that are very dangerous to us, needless to say. Next slide. Did that move? No, I think you go back. This is just basically the question, is this actually acceptable? Should we be having these guys in our stock market? 68% said no. Next slide. The question that came up at the end, I mentioned it earlier. Should Chinese companies get a pass from the kind of transparency requirements that American companies have to meet? 72% said no. Next slide. How about this? To the point, we're here. Should presidential candidates be asked these sorts of questions and be responsive to voters in places like this? Well, you see, it's rather obvious to most Americans. Yes, they should. Next slide. This is a question about, would this matter to you? How presidential candidates answer these sorts of questions. And you see, these are candidates, the answer is, would you be less likely to vote for a candidate who seems not to care about China? And the answer was pretty impressive, 58% there. Next slide. How important would it be in deciding your vote? 59%. Next slide. Would you support a candidate that suggests we ought to just keep doing business as we have been? You heard what Joe Bosco said about that. 57% said no. How about next slide? Would you support a candidate who wants a different kind of approach? Well, according to this poll, 63% said yes. I think that's the last slide. So here's the bottom line, folks. There are some very important questions, and these are just a few. We asked about 40. That pretty consistently, most of us didn't know much about. They learned something from the questions, and when they got some information, they responded as, well, frankly, I would expect most of us to respond. With common sense. And with a strong conviction that this is a problem, and it needs to be addressed as such. So that's why we're here. That's why we're so glad you're here, and why we're so hopeful that you will be willing and able to give us a hand in spreading the word and making sure that those who would like to lead us know that you care about this and need to be responsive to your concerns. With that, Jay, did you want to close?
Yeah, I'll close it up here, and maybe we'll get some questions in a minute. But I think this has been a powerful set of information that I would guess much of it is new information to many people in the room. And it identifies some things that are, I think, very serious threats to, we say it's threats to our country, we say it's threats to security, but in the end, I think it really is a threat to our freedoms. Because if you, how many of you actually, let me just ask this, how many of you have been familiar with the idea that China has imposed the social credit scoring system? How many people are? Very good number of you actually. And so now imagine that system here in the United States or some other system like that and how that would destroy our freedoms. That just motivates me like nothing else to say, this is a threat we've got to stop now. Don't know if many of you were looking at the caucus on the TV news last week or the newspaper, but there were 3 arrests in Boston last week. 3 arrests of espionage going on of very important military secrets. In fact, a professor from Harvard, professor who was the chairman of the chemistry department, was arrested. He had taken hundreds of thousands of dollars selling secrets to the Chinese government. Another one of the 3 was a graduate student who was caught at Logan Airport smuggling biological substance back into China. And it goes on. The reason I mention these is that these are not isolated incidents at all. This is really the tip of the iceberg. This is going on all throughout the United States. There are 300,000 or 400,000 Chinese students in our colleges and universities here in the country. Every one of them has to sign a document before they leave China that they will disclose any and all information that they learn in the United States to the Chinese government, the Communist Party. And we also know, not all of them may be spies, but we know that many of them are. So this is something we need to be tremendously vigilant about. With that, I'd love to just spend a few minutes, anybody has to leave, we'll understand that, but a few questions and answers. But before we do that even, how about just a little round of applause for these two? Anybody have a question or questions for anybody? Pete, for that, please.
Well, I've got a story, but I'm going to start off with, I work for a major wire firm with the stock market. And it's really interesting to watch the transparency of the Chinese markets. They just decided that the lunar holiday, which was going to be 7 days, was then going to become 10 days. And they were doing that, I think, because they were trying to mediate some of this information about the virus, so that they wouldn't get hit quite so badly. So all of those of you who had some stocks in these China companies, when they closed this morning, because they're a day ahead of us, they were down 8% on the Chinese market. I hope that didn't affect the retirement program too much. Anytime that China decides that their economy is going to grow by 7%, they set that goal, and guess what? It's a 7%. Like you point out, how do they measure that? The government just announces it, and everybody goes, okay. Not the way to play the game. Now my story. In 1989, I was a naval officer on the USS Blue Ridge, and we were visiting Shanghai. And the ship came into port, first port visit by a U.S. warship, and probably since World War II, I know what it might have been. Some of the people who study the history probably know a little better than I. And we were there to let the admirals visit and create a little bit more, quote-unquote, normalcy between the navies of China and the 7th Fleet. The USS Blue Ridge is a 7th Fleet flagship. And we got a chance to visit some of the Chinese ships at the time. And when I visited, and remember this is 1989, 30-something years ago, none of these ships in my mind were ready for sea at all. I don't think they were going to be capable of even fighting a wastebasket fire on their ships. They were just not ready. I was asked if I wanted to go down and visit I was in my whites. The admiral, he really couldn't say no. So we went down into one of the submarines to visit. He came back up all covered with grease. He was dirty and he was not a happy camper. Now for the rest of the story, and especially for you, sir. When we left territorial waters, Tiananmen Square happened. And I think we delayed it for some number of days when we were in port in Shanghai. So I got a really personal feedback relationship with your story. I think we actually delayed Tiananmen Square for some number of days because they did not want anything to occur when we were in country. Does that sound like China to you? Okay. So what would I be doing? I'd be thinking about divesting from my China positions. It's really hard to do that because they're everywhere. And you probably have been mail ordering through Alibaba, Chinese company. How do you do without Alibaba? You know, it's everywhere. So it's going to be hard to decouple, but remember that $1.1 trillion worth of treasuries, if anything happened, why don't we just stop paying interest? That would be really unhappy campers on that end. But then again, they could stop paying any dividends or things for us too. So it works both ways.
I see a question in the back.
It's actually more question for Frank. People leaving, you're giving some handouts after, but in those who are on streaming online, if they want to learn more, you have podcasts, you have other ways of publication, people can get more engaged. How can they learn more? How can they go about it?
Thank you very much. The website for the poll and for scores of videos that we have done to date. Most of them are short for the attention span challenged. All of them are highly informative by really world-class experts on these subjects. All of these are available at presentdangerchina.org. presentdangerchina.org. We welcome your visit.
Time for maybe one more question if there's another question. Yes, please, Dan.
Yeah, just a quick question. So I know I work in a tech field, and if we, communicate with Huawei or HiSilicon, for instance, we are dead meat. So kind of a two-part question. When we talk about state retirement funds being invested in some of these companies that are on the entities list, one, maybe I missed it in the video, but how many states kind of have this investment? I know New Hampshire is one, unfortunately, but how many are there out there? And two, what are some ways, if any ways exist, any examples of how state legislatures have gone about eliminating that influence and removing them from their retirements?
It's great questions. I think the answer, I wish Roger were here, and he wishes he were here too, but he couldn't make it today. I think the answer would be probably every state pension fund has this problem. You may have seen in the video that there's sort of two categories of holdings: actively traded ones and passively traded ones. And in the passively traded ones, there are now, depending on which of the indexes is being used, between 7 and 20%. One is an emerging market fund that's going to 45% Chinese companies. So you think this is a problem now? Wait. We have just begun having conversations with state legislators, including yours here today. We have had a sponsor for legislation in Iowa volunteer last week to see if he could enact at least a resolution, maybe legislation, that would establish this principle that we talked about, that no matter whose companies there are, Chinese, there are also Russian companies, by the way, in the New Hampshire Public Pension Fund, they all have to meet the same standards in order to be considered for holding in this portfolio. That would go a long way to addressing some of the concerns that we have, we think. But we're at the very beginning of this process, and again, we'd love to see first in the nation happen in this case here too.
We'd love to see that legislation from Iowa, so we have some language to go by.
Count on it.
Yeah.
For sure.
Did you have the same question? Okay. Yeah.
Well, good. We'll end it here. We say thank you. Well done. Very glad.